We have both Dan Jasper and Yusuf Jameel from Project Drawdown. Dan Jasper is our policy advisor here at Project Drawdown, and he connects climate science and human well-being data to the international and U.S. policy-making processes. Dan draws upon over a decade of public policy experience to advocate for intersectional policies and financing that simultaneously address poverty alleviation and climate resilience in low and middle income countries. Yusuf Jameel is an associate data scientist at Project Drawdown, and Yusuf explores how climate solutions can simultaneously address equity and human well-being by improving aspects of public health, food, water, and energy security. Yusuf earned his PhD from the University of Utah in water resources, and he previously worked as a researcher at MIT and the University of Florida, where he led several projects focused on the food, energy, water nexus. It is my pleasure to ask Dan Jasper and Yusuf Jameel to come on, and actually Yusuf is going to start us off today. So thank you both so much for joining us. As a reminder to everybody, we'll have Yusuf present first, followed by Dan, and then we'll have time for questions for both of our panelists. So, Yusuf, take it away. All right, Yusuf, we just need you to unmute, and you are all set. Take it away, Yusuf.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us today. Dan and I are thrilled to talk about climate and human well-being and biodiversity challenges that we are facing today. In the first part of this talk, I will talk about how we can simultaneously address climate change, biodiversity loss, and human well-being. In the second part, Dan will talk about the challenges associated with implementing these solutions and what are the policy and financial actions we need to take to implement these powerful solutions. Climate change is the biggest threat of this century. From shifting weather patterns to rising sea level, the impact of climate change is global in scope and unprecedented in scale. The world is not on track to meet the Paris Agreement, and the latest IPCC assessment makes clear the world is fast approaching an irreversible level of global heating. The world is also experiencing massive biodiversity loss and environmental degradation. Biodiversity is fast declining than any time in human history. Natural ecosystems have declined by 47% on average. A recent study has shown that human activities have caused the Earth to exceed 6 out of its 9 planetary boundaries, pushing the environment well outside the safe operating space for humanity. Improving well-being and providing everyone a dignified life is an important goal for humanity. The last 4 decades have seen rapid improvement in economic growth and decline in extreme poverty, alongside improvement in life expectancy, adult literacy, reduction in child and maternal mortalities, and reduction in malnourishment. However, much work remains. In sub-Saharan Africa, about 40% of the population still lives in extreme poverty. Globally, 2.5 billion people, or about 30% of the global population, still suffers from energy poverty. And in 2022, about 1.3 billion people were food insecure. Addressing these 3 challenges are critical for a just and equitable world. And although these 3 challenges might seem distinct, but they're in fact closely intertwined. Let's look at poverty and human well-being. Human well-being and poverty are closely linked, and climate change threatens decades of progress across multiple areas of human development. The reality is that climate change doesn't impact everyone equally. Low and middle income countries are historically the lowest greenhouse gas emitters, yet they are disproportionately impacted by climate change. People experiencing poverty commonly live in regions that have been are projected to be the worst impacted by climate change. Rural population and indigenous people are also very vulnerable. The codependence of climate and human well-being is illustrated in the Sahel region in Africa, which is already one of the most poor. And without urgent climate actions, the region could see an additional 13.5 million people being pushed back into poverty by 2050. On the other side of the equation, as low and middle income countries strive to provide energy, better health services, and improve food security, it's important that those efforts do not lead to investment in projects resulting in carbon lock-in for decades and become a major source of greenhouse gas emissions in the coming year. Human development efforts that contribute or will contribute to greenhouse gas emissions will end negating advances in poverty alleviation, food security, and human well-being. There is a major window of opportunity for low and middle income countries to really leapfrog and rely on cleaner technologies to achieve human well-being goals. For example, with proper access to finance, the sub-Saharan African countries could meet more than 2/3 of their electricity goals from renewable sources by 2050. The link between climate and biodiversity is also very strong. Climate change impacts biodiversity through direct and indirect mechanisms, leading to a shift in ecosystem and species distribution. As global temperature rises, habitat becomes inhospitable, forcing many species to migrate or face extinction. Similarly, biodiversity loss can initiate feedback loops that exacerbate climate change and climate impacts. Biodiversity loss weakens nature's resilience to climate extremes, making them more vulnerable to extreme climate events such as droughts and hurricanes. Many ecosystems, especially trees, are carbon sinks. However, when these ecosystems degrade or are destroyed, their capacity to sequester carbon diminishes and they might become a greenhouse gas source. Similarly, when we look at human actions, we know that human beings are responsible for biodiversity loss. But the reality is that human well-being is closely linked with biodiversity. Biodiversity provides numerous ecosystem services that is crucial for our well-being in present and in future. For example, a biodiverse wetland ecosystem is essential for filter and purifying water, which are in decline and risking water quality for many communities globally. Recognizing the importance of restoring biodiversity, countries signed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework last year to restore 30% of the world's degraded ecosystem by 2030 and mobilize $200 billion annually by 2030 for biodiversity action. Given the interconnectedness between climate change, biodiversity, and human well-being, it is surprising that by and large, all the three issues have mostly been addressed in silos. The immensity of these challenges require that we cannot prioritize one solution over another or address one without considering the other. Human well-being, biodiversity loss, and climate change needs to be addressed simultaneously. The good news is that all these three challenges are part of the same planetary crisis, and there is a pathway to reach the three seemingly disparate destinations via the same route. The question is, how do we do that? By prioritizing highly effective actions that addresses all the three challenges at the same time. The first set of actions requires changes in the way we grow our food. About 21% of greenhouse gas emissions are from the forestry, agriculture, and land use sector. Changing the way we grow our food by adopting practices such as abandoned farmland restoration, conservative agriculture, agroforestry, nutrient management, and improving land tenure can rapidly decrease the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this sector. These are powerful climate solutions as they improve soil carbon storage. Our calculations show that interventions focused on improving agriculture, including reduction in food loss and food waste, can result in a global annual emission reductions of about 8 gigatons per year. These solutions also have significant human well-being co-benefits. We mapped the co-benefits of these solutions on human well-being by reviewing hundreds of articles. Our analysis showed that adopting these practices directly improve food security. Other direct benefits includes increase in income and better access to water and sanitation. Indirect benefits includes improvement in access to education, energy, better housing, health, and gender equality. For instance, solutions such as sustainable intensification of a smallholders, farmers, or agroforestry can lead to higher yield and boost food security and or increase income and provide buffer against extreme climate event by improving soil health. Increase in household income can be used to purchase energy, which can further help in reducing food spoilage, or purchase a mobile phone that can improve access to better market and improve the income or increase the income of farmers. Food security and increase in income can then contribute to better health and gender equality. Changing the way we farm has also many benefits for biodiversity. For example, in Africa, 75% of the agricultural growth is coming from farmland expansion into forest and the savannas. This leads to habitat loss and fragmentation that directly contributes to biodiversity loss. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is home to the largest rainforest in Africa, more than 1 million hectares of forest is lost every year, primarily for farming. On the other side of Africa, in the Sahel and the West Africa region, land degradation is a major issue. Africa right now is losing about 4 million hectares of forest every year and has more than 700 million hectares of degraded land that could be brought back and could be farmed. Solutions such as restoring farmland, abandoned farmland, can bring these degraded farmland back to life, preventing farmers from clearing forest and turning it into cropland, and thereby directly protecting biodiversity. Changing the way we grow food is vital to address the triple challenge of climate change, biodiversity loss, and human well-being. Well, when we change the way we grow our food, we also need to simultaneously protect and restore ecosystems that are vital for meeting these triple goals. A significant portion, about 11% of the annual greenhouse gas emissions, are due to deforestation, which is equivalent to the emissions from the United States of America. However, the impact of deforestation is not limited to greenhouse gas emissions only. It also results in biodiversity loss. Deforestation is a particular concern in tropical rainforest because these forests are home to much of the world's biodiversity. In fact, there is no road to net zero or reversing biodiversity without protecting and restoring ecosystems. Ecosystems also provide multiple benefits for people. These include provisions such as food, water, timber, protecting and reducing the impact of flooding, storm surge, and drought, and is of cultural significance and spiritual significance to many communities globally. A global analysis of protected areas in 34 low and middle income countries showed that households near protected areas have higher level of wealth and lower likelihood of poverty. Children also benefit tremendously from having a better health. Solutions such as wetland and mangrove protection also results in human well-being benefit for coastal communities by causing recovery of shrimp and fish population and hence increasing incomes from fishing and shrimping. Wetland and mangroves also increase resilience to natural hazards. One solution I really want to highlight among the several for protecting and restoring ecosystem is the importance of securing indigenous peoples' land tenure. Approximately 22% of all forest carbon in tropical and subtropical countries is on land managed by indigenous people. The carbon on indigenous lands is primarily in soil in the three largest tropical peatland region, the Southeast Asia, the Central Congo River Basin, and West-Southwestern Amazonia. Indigenous communities safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Forests on their lands are better managed with higher biodiversity than those on non-indigenous land. The good news is that the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed last year explicitly includes the importance of respecting indigenous people rights and knowledge and including them in participation in decision-making. While changing the way we grow our food and protecting ecosystems are powerful solutions, decreasing energy poverty is equally crucial to address these interconnected challenges. Energy poverty is pervasive in low and middle income countries, with 2.3 billion people not having access to clean cooking fuel and about 700 million people lacking access to electricity. Energy is central to modern life. A recent study of linkages between multidimensional poverty and electricity found that people in countries with limited access to electricity also suffer from high food insecurity, lack access to improved water and sanitation, experience low income and work, and endure poor health. Providing access to clean electricity has the potential to reduce emissions by hundreds of gigatons between now and 2050. But more importantly, it has the ability to transform the well-being of remote, under-resourced, and vulnerable communities. For instance, in Bangladesh, which has championed off-grid and microgrid solar photovoltaics, 20 million people have gained access to electricity in the last few years, changing their lives in multiple positive ways. When we talk about energy poverty, providing clean cooking solutions to everyone by 2030, which is also a UN Sustainable Developmental Goal, is perhaps one of the most powerful climate solutions that can be implemented today, which can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 gigaton per year, or about 2% of annual global emissions, in par with the entire aviation industry. However, access to clean cooking is not only a climate solution, it is also a human right and biodiversity issue. Every year, 3.2 million people die due to indoor air pollution, resulting from usage of unclean fuel that results in emission of black carbon and other pollutants. It is estimated that the combined adverse impact of solid fuel cooking on health, environment, and gender equality is $2.4 trillion annually. Rapidly providing clean cooking fuel will have tremendous benefits for health and food security, and indirect benefits on gender equality, education, and income. In many low and middle income countries, demand for charcoal to cook is a major cause of deforestation also. Across sub-Saharan Africa, wood is a major source of energy. Countries in East and Central Africa have lost millions of hectares of forest to produce charcoal. Providing clean cooking to everyone is perhaps one of the most powerful solutions that could be achieved by 2030 and contributes to human well-being, climate change, and reducing biodiversity loss. Beyond the health impact, black carbon emissions from the use of unclean fuel is intensifying the snow and glacier melt in the Arctic and the Himalayas. Reduction of black carbon is vital for preserving the Arctic ecosystem and avoiding critical environmental tipping points, and slowing the glacier melt in the Himalayas to preserve the water security of billions of people living in the Indo-Gangetic plains of Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan in the coming decades. Whereas each of these interventions that I've highlighted are critical to address the triple challenge of climate change, well-being, and biodiversity loss, we need to implement these solutions as a single system to successfully achieve all the goals. For instance, effort to reduce deforestation will not be successful in communities that suffer from energy poverty and rely on wood to obtain their basic energy needs. In these communities, effort to reduce deforestation should be complemented by provisions to provide clean fuel options. People who are involved right now in the supply chain of charcoal and solid fuel should be actively integrated in the supply chain of clean fuel. Similarly, the role of clean energy is critical to achieve food security, such as those through solar pumps, to access groundwater, and powering cold storage. In many low and middle income countries, food loss can exceed 30%. Just by addressing food loss through cold storages, many countries can improve their food insecurity. To end my talk, I would like to share an example from the Gorongosa National Park, Mozambique, which suffered civil wars for decades. It is a good example where human well-being, climate, and biodiversity were addressed simultaneously. Private organizations and the government came together to improve human life and conserve biodiversity. Integrating well-being and conservation resulted in an increase in forest cover, decrease in wildlife poaching. There was an increase in population of many species. More than 11,000 farmers have increased crop yield due to better farming practices. Investment in sustainable agricultural activities led to improvement in livelihood. This led to ripple effects on better health, gender equality, better access to education. Now, the question is, given that how powerful these solutions are from a climate, well-being, and biodiversity point of view, one would assume that they are the top priorities for policymakers and climate funders. Yet, these powerful solutions have been widely underutilized. And to discuss the causes and factors and how we can address them, I would now hand over to my colleague Dan to take over. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yusuf. That was brilliant and sets up my portion of the presentation perfectly. It's almost like we planned it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as I do so, I'm just going to reintroduce myself. I'm the policy advisor for Project Drawdown, and I'm based in Washington, D.C., where we are having an absolutely gorgeous fall day. It's such a thrill to see so many people from around the world join us today. This makes it such a great conversation, and I can't wait to get into the Q&A. Oftentimes when we give these presentations and people like Yusuf outline these great solutions, one of the first questions we get is, that sounds wonderful and great and makes a lot of sense. So why aren't we doing it? To answer that question, it's a little complicated. And we have to look under the hood of climate finance a little bit. Climate finance is a pretty big term, and I think it has different connotations in different contexts and to different people. So when we're talking about big issue sets and like sort of universes of issue sets like climate finance, I find it's helpful to sort of orientate myself along dimensional space. So let me just show you what I mean here. To talk about climate finance, we can look at two things. We can look along the first dimension here, which would be the public sector on one end and the private sector on the other. So we have the government on one side and we have businesses on the other. And it is a spectrum because obviously they interact and there are partnerships, right? Along the y-axis, we could think of what do tools or actors in this space try to do? Are they raising capital or are they distributing capital? Are they distributing money or are they raising it? Okay, so that's just kind of a basic orientation. And if we wanted to go further, we could do a z-axis on recipients and lendees, but I'm not going to go that far and I'm just going to keep it simple today. But using this sort of orientation, we can look at climate finance tools and we can sort of map them out where they might be. So again, just to give you an idea of like how or what people use to flow climate finance. If we look at the public sector and the distributing capital quadrant here, you'll see grants, pretty straightforward, giving money. The public sector raising capital quadrant, you can see things like loans and green bonds. Green bonds are just like normal bonds, except the proceeds go towards climate initiatives. So on the private sector side, in terms of distributing capital, we also have grants, pretty straightforward. And then raising capital, we have things like ESG funds, green bonds, corporate green bonds are now increasing as well. And there's a whole host of tools that we could think about and try to map out here. But I just want to give two more examples to show where things can be kind of liminal and sort of straddle some of these quadrants. One thing we hear about quite frequently lately is debt for nature swaps, which is essentially setting aside some nature in exchange for debt forgiveness. So that's on the public sector side because we're dealing with national debt, but it's not quite raising capital and it's not quite distributing capital either. So it sort of sits in between there. We can also look at carbon markets, which is getting a lot of attention lately. Carbon markets are regulated by the public sector, but they are largely carried out in the private sector. So they kind of sit in between there. But they're distributing capital because carbon markets are essentially taxes. And anytime you have a tax, it's redistributing wealth. Okay, so these are just some ideas, again, to try to orientate us in this vast world of climate finance. We can do the same thing with climate finance actors, and we can look at who's at play here. So in the public sector, in the distributing capital side or quadrant, we have things like the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Innovation Fund, Adaptation Fund, Global Environment Facility. We also have aid agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development. They also hand out grants alongside the climate funds, as well as carry out humanitarian projects, right? On the public sector raising capital side, we have things like multilateral development banks. Multilateral development banks are banks that are chaired by 2 or more countries that hand out loans for development purposes. Probably the most famous example would be like the World Bank. There's also development corporations, which are public entities, but invest in the private sector. And they may even take equity in private businesses, but they are publicly owned. So they're on the raising capital side. On the private sector side, for distributing capital, we have things like philanthropies and foundations that act much in the same way that funds and aid agencies do in terms of handing out grants. In terms of raising capital, we have businesses and private banks. And of course, we have public-private partnerships, which can really exist anywhere along that y-axis. Just kind of depends on what they're set up to do and what the context is. Okay, so I hope that provides a little bit of orientation. And I want to just say for the remainder of my part of this presentation, I'm going to focus in on the public sector. Being a policy guy, that's kind of where my focus is. I'm going to leave the private sector side to my colleagues in our Drawdown Labs program, which have amazing resources, and I encourage you to check out. But for now, we're going to focus on the public side of this. When we're talking about climate finance on the public international sphere, you know, we just went through the actors and how money moves, but what does it actually do? When we're talking about it in the international public sphere, we usually put things into 3 buckets, which was outlined by the Paris Agreement. So the first sort of bucket is mitigation. There's like things like putting up solar panels and wind turbines, things that will reduce our emissions potential in the future. Pretty straightforward. We also have adaptation, measures that are basically helping us adapt to a changing environment. Like a classic example would be like a flood barrier. It's going to protect a community from rising sea levels, but it's not going to draw down our emissions. Nonetheless, still important. And then the last one, which you're probably hearing quite a bit about recently, is loss and damage, which has to do with responding to climate disasters. I'll talk a little bit more about why that's such an important issue right now, but by and large, I can just say that last COP27, they agreed to establish a fund, and now we're seeing that debate play out for what a loss and damage fund would look like. This will make more sense as I talk about some of the issues that we're facing in climate finance. Okay, so all that looks like it's just kind of the basic picture, right? That's great. We're raising capital, we're distributing it, we have all these actors at play, and we know where to put the money, but we're still not there yet. So what's happening here on the back end? Well, I'm going to just sort of put them into 3 broad categories. The first is, and probably on everybody's mind and pretty obvious, there's not enough funding. Okay, total climate finance amounts to about 632 billion per year, but we'll need about 5 trillion at a conservative estimate at the global level, and about 2 trillion for low and middle income countries. So we're far short of what we need. Another case in point here is that in 2009, rich countries agreed to raise $100 billion a year for low and middle income countries for climate projects. They have never once met that target. And while they're getting close this year to meeting that target, it's important to point out that $100 billion in 2009 is not the same as $100 billion in 2023, just from inflation alone. So even if they meet that promise, it's not going to be enough money, but it is a good starting point. Another point that we're seeing is that the money's not going to the right place. Some of you may have seen this special report that Reuters, big local news, and Stanford University came out with this summer. It tracked a lot of the climate finance, and the results were not encouraging. It showed climate finance was paying for things like gelato shops, airport expansions, luxury hotels, and even coal power plants. But none of this is breaking the rules of climate finance, because when countries pledge to commit to climate finance, there are no guidelines determining what qualifies as climate finance. So if a country wants to claim something as climate finance, there's not a whole lot you can do to argue with them. It's quite unfortunate, and some people are even calling it the Wild West of finance. The study that I just mentioned examined about 10% of climate finance projects, and what they found, again, was pretty disturbing. About $3 billion had nothing to do with climate at all. About $65 billion was recorded so vaguely, we have no idea where the money went. Now, there's a little bit of a point there in that there's difficulties in bureaucracies in tracking money, but still, we should be able to tell where $65 billion went, right? Lastly, they also found that $500 million was counted towards climate finance for projects that were canceled and were never carried out, and no payments were actually made, and yet they counted 500 million towards climate finance. So it's not going to the right place. And another important example here that Yusuf also mentioned here is that 733 million people in Africa lack access to energy, but just 2% of renewable energy investments are going to the continent, despite the fact that it is the most well-suited place for a lot of renewable energy. So this represents a huge inefficiency in the climate finance realm, right? The third big bucket, I will say, is that it's not given in an equitable way. We just looked at some of the tools that climate finance uses. I think when people think international climate finance, they typically think that it's given in grant form. That's not really the case. Climate finance breaks down to about 6% being grant-based or grant-given. It's about $36 billion. About 33% of climate finance is equity investments, and 61%, or about $384 billion, are loans. Now, just 12% of those loans are called concessional or low-cost loans. Concessional or low cost means there's a lower interest payment and a longer repayment period, which makes it a little easier for low and middle income country. But just 12% of loans are concessional or low cost, meaning the vast majority of them are at commercial rates, which is very high for national debts to take on. In fact, Oxfam estimates that low and middle income countries are actually paying about $232 million per day in order to finance loans, development and climate finance loans. So now we have a situation where countries are taking from health and education programs in order to pay off climate and development from loans. That is wildly, I think, self-detrimental, right? Low and middle income countries are not pleased by this, as you might well reason. And I remember very distinctly an ambassador in the last climate talks, the UN climate talks that happened in June, saying very clearly that they're being asked to rob Peter to pay Paul. And as Yusuf just outlined, these are cohesive systems. We have to see health and education as part of the climate response. So we cannot be taking money from there and putting it into climate. It just doesn't make sense. We can also just quickly look at the pillars that I mentioned and like how money is allocated between each pillar. So the first one about an adaptation, there's about 7% of climate finance goes to adaptation. About 90% goes towards mitigation, and about 3% goes to projects that could count as both. Now, carrying this forward just a little bit, about 75% of climate finance flows domestically, and the vast majority of mitigation efforts are taking place in North America, Europe, and East Asia. So if you follow those data points, what you're seeing here is that countries with capital are raising the most capital and keeping that capital, while low and middle income countries who have done the least to support this crisis, to contribute to this crisis, are now being asked to pay loans to high income countries who have caused this crisis. A lot of low income countries point out that they like to see a lot of parity or balance between adaptation and mitigation financing, given that the struggles that low and middle income countries face. So those are some of the issues that we're facing. That's sort of at the high level. Let's look in and zoom in on one solution that Yusuf mentioned and see what that looks like playing out. Yusuf mentioned clean cooking, and I'll just mention quickly that we're working with Clean Cooking Alliance currently, and we'll be issuing a policy brief about clean cooking because it's such an important issue. But right now, I just want to zoom in on the finances of it. And I did see that there was a comment in the questions, or there was a question about what is clean cooking. I'll show an example in 1 second. But right now, let's just look at the finances. So right now, we're currently investing about $200 million per year in clean cooking initiatives, and universal access would cost us about $10 billion. Now, that might look like a huge gap, and it might even look daunting, but it is nothing, I promise you, compared to the costs of inaction. The cost of the status quo right now is costing us $2.4 trillion every year in health-related costs and lost productivity. So that's huge. That's astronomical compared to universal access costs. This simplistic sort of analogy would be like if you had a leaky faucet in your home that cost you $2,400 every year, and a plumber said, I could fix that for you just for $10 a year. Most people would just pay the plumber, right? It's overly simplistic, but that's an important example of how much money is being left on the table, not to mention all the human lives being affected. You can further break this down into public-private sector along that spectrum that I showed. And we can see that most funding for clean cooking is provided by the private organizations. The public sector is only providing about 12%. That's like $24 million. That's scant compared to all the benefits that clean cooking access could achieve. So just this way of, just by looking at this chart, we already know there's ample room to grow public investment in clean cooking initiatives. And then just a reminder of like, why is this important? It can save 3.2 million lives, $2.4 trillion every year, and 1 gigaton of emissions, which is the same as the aviation industry. So that's quite remarkable. For the person who asked what example of clean cooking is, there's all sorts of different methods that exist. This is a picture of one method that feeds wood into a highly efficient burner. And you can see that it's on, and there's not much smoke coming out because it's burning it so efficiently. If this was an open fire, smoke would be bellowing out. So there's all sorts of different technologies and engineering things you can do to make it burn efficiently. Some of them work with briquettes, some of them straight with wood, some of them with LPG or liquefied petroleum gas, that kind of stuff. Further, universal clean cooking access also improves gender equality. The people who are responsible for cooking and collecting fuel wood are often women and girls. So giving them their time back would be huge. We can, and Yusuf also mentioned biodiversity loss, food and water security, and so many other issues. So the $10 billion starts to look pretty scant when you look at the cost of inaction and what we have to gain from this. Okay, so there's some examples. There's the high level, one zoomed in solution. And then I think we start to wonder in our mind and start to think about what are the fixes that need to take place in order to start making capital flow more efficiently towards climate, human well-being, and biodiversity well-being. I think you can separate that into two kind of buckets. One are the immediate fixes that we can do to institutions now that will start to improve things. And the other bucket is like the ideal world that we want to build. Let's just start with the immediate fixes, and I'll go through three general buckets. The first, as probably evident from this presentation, is that we'd like to see increased intersectional financing. Projects that do both adaptation and mitigation are ample, but they are not being financed at the levels we'd like to see. I mentioned that just 3% of climate finance goes to intersectional projects, so there's ample room to bring that up. We want to see countries, especially rich countries, live up to their promises to meet the $100 billion and ideally start going beyond that. But first, we have to get to that $100 billion. And I think it's important for the capital, of course. It's also important to start building goodwill, because I think a lot of high-income countries have lost a lot of goodwill because it's been over a decade of that promise and they're not meeting it. So we got to start building trust as well. And then I think, another broad one that might be pretty obvious at this point is that we need financial guidelines and accountability here. If a country makes a pledge for climate finance, we need to spell out what counts as climate finance. We need to also have accountability mechanisms and be able to track these in a much more legitimate way. Looking at the long-term reform, I will just say that, I use the word ideal. I don't want to give the impression that this is something that is far off in a sort of like rainbow land. I think that now more than ever, real reform is possible because of where we are with the climate, because of where we are with tensions between high income countries and low middle income countries. We are hearing more substance around things like multilateral development bank reform. This is a really crucial conversation, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about it in the coming months and years. So what do we need to start thinking about for those reform efforts? The first, this is going to sound like a platitude, but it needs to be science-driven and community-led, which sounds commonplace. But I just outlined some of the data, and this is not taking place currently. The vast majority of climate finance is being dictated by loan officers. Nothing against loan officers as people, but it needs to be science-driven, and the community needs to tell us where they need the assistance, and the science can help identify what might be the appropriate solutions. We also need a financial system that's fit for purpose. You hear this phrase quite frequently in the climate finance space. And basically right now we're looking at a finance system that is only centered on profits. And right now, conversation is playing out quite in depth at the World Bank. There is a new president that was named in June. He's had some candid remarks to reporters lately that said that, look, we would love to do things like debt cancellation and start reformatting some of this stuff, but the institutional mandate is such that it sort of puts us in this bind where we're not really able to break out. So we need to start envisioning what a financial system would be that actually centers human, biodiversity, and climate well-being instead of profits. Like, what would that look like is such an interesting question, and I think really opens up really intriguing questions around statecraft that we're going to be starting to grapple with in the years ahead. The last one, this is a little bit more specific than the first two, but there's no way around it. We have to start talking about massive debt cancellation. There's just no way we can do a robust response to climate with the debt that we currently have. And so we really need to start considering that and find a way to make that happen, especially for low and middle income countries. I really appreciate everybody's attention. I am super curious to dive into the questions. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm just going to hand it over back to Elizabeth to save us some time here.
Amazing. Thank you. If I can get Yusuf back on screen, and if we can all give them a round of applause. We get to see Yusuf and Dan full form in Zoom land. Hi guys, way to go. I love learning from you so much. So does my dog. There you have it. So I want to know what I know some inside info because I have the privilege of working with you, but I'd love to know what's next. Like we did this webinar. What are some things that our audience can look forward to in the coming months from your research? So why don't I start with you, Yusuf, and then I'd love to hear from you, Dan.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, we're doing many work right now to really advance the science in the field of climate well-being and biodiversity loss. First and foremost, I think in the next month, we'll be launching a Black Carbon report that really highlights why addressing Black carbon is such an important issue globally, and the different benefits it have, and what are the policy actions that we can take to actually implement. So it will not only highlight the sciences, but it also highlight the pathways that we can take to implement solutions that can reduce Black carbon. So keep your eyes open for that work. It will be launched probably in 2-3 weeks, and we are really trying hard to promote, countries include Black carbon in their nationally determined contributions, which is what they submit to the UNFCCC to meet Paris Agreement goals. And we also want the UNFCCC to include Black carbon as a potential climate pollutant in the list of pollutants. The next work is much more deeper. We are taking a deep dive in really trying to map the co-benefits of different climate solutions that Project Drawdown is famous for, And most of the solutions that we have has multiple level of co-benefits, and our idea is to focus mostly on food solutions right now, on the food sector, but eventually expand those co-benefits to human beings, to biodiversity, to other ecosystems in the coming months and years. So keep your eyes open for that. That's coming out from our team in the next few months, and I'll pass it on to Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Yusuf. And I see a note here asking how is this question connected to the subject of the webinar? So I just want to draw that distinction really quick, is that I think, we set out the problem statement here, and now we're saying this is the action that we're taking based on this knowledge in order to make some changes here. We're not just giving presentations, although that is useful, obviously. One of the things I'll just quickly highlight coming out of my work is a policy brief that I mentioned with Clean Cooking Alliance that will look at clean cooking. We're going to talk about the environmental side of this and the need to incorporate it in the food systems transformation conversation. Clean cooking, the one reason we're highlighting it too is that it gets marginalized quite a bit in a lot of different conversations. So we're trying to center this a little bit more, dive into some of these solutions and start to show what are the granular level of detail and finances policies that we can do to improve those solutions.
Great. Thanks, Yusuf and Dan. So to kind of underscore Dan's point, these webinars are such a great way for us to connect with all of you. Thanks for being here. And we want to let you know what's on the horizon. And a number of you have been asking what you can do. So Dan and Yusuf, sometimes for those of us living in in places like the United States, it might seem like, well, what's my role? What can I do? So I'd love to hear from both of you about what's your ask of the audience? What would you love to see them step into as they leave the webinar today?
Dan, you want to go? Okay. Yeah, I think there are many actions that that people can take depending upon how much they're involved. Are they individual? Are they working in the policy space? Are they working with the government? The first and foremost thing that Diane highlighted, and I would like to reiterate, is that climate finance need a new benchmark for success. It's not how much money it returns, but rather how many lives it saves, how much greenhouse gas emissions reduction it takes place, and how it contributes to resilience. It's time that we prioritize human well-being over return. So that's kind of the overall view. In terms of, if you're a policymaker from a low and middle income countries, when you are resubmitting the national determined contributions to UNFCCC in 2025, make sure to include these intersectional solutions. We did an analysis last year, right before COP27, and what we found that in many countries, some very powerful solutions that contribute to climate change, that contribute to reducing biodiversity loss, that contribute to human well-being, were missing. So try and get those solutions incorporated into the NDCs so that those actions are being implemented at an individual level. There are many actions you can take, reducing food waste, and we just produced a full list of solutions that individuals can take, that maybe Elizabeth, if you could put it in the chat, that would be great. And these can really help you significantly reduce your carbon footprint, and that's great actions that you can take at individual level. If you are from the private sector, I think really when we think about beyond value chain mitigation, think about these super powerful solutions that you can invest in, that is transformational on so many different aspects. So as we need private capital to really implement these solutions, and knowing what are the most impactful solutions, I think it's very important to engage with local governments, with local NGOs, and try to contribute your part, do your thing to implement these solutions.
Yeah, that was great. I guess I'll just quickly add on to the individual notion that I don't want to give platitudes like vote, but I will say that using your voice is incredibly important, especially if you are in a high-income country. Saying that you're paying attention to this, getting involved with local organizations that do advocacy is extremely important. Just the administration knowing that the population is paying attention to this stuff automatically changes the conversation. So staying aware and staying engaged on that level, again, I don't mean it to sound like a platitude, but I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you're getting a lot of support from people. I think we know that it is a yes and, right? It's a yes, we need individual actions, and we need to pull a lot of levers at in different spheres. And one of those is actually COP28. So Dan in particular, Yusuf, you're welcome to respond as well. But Dan, I'd love to know what some of your priorities and hopes are for for COP28.
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? Let me boil it down to like 1 minute here. One thing that we're going to see coming out of COP28 is the global stocktake, which is an assessment of how far we've come since Paris. So it's going to look at where we're at currently. And what it's going to say, I think, is going to be really important because it's going to be an impetus for the next 5 years. They're supposed to do a global stocktake every 5 years in assessment. So hopefully I would like this document. I hope it's talks about some of the intersectional things that we're talking about here and alludes to the fact that the international financial system is not fit for purpose. We'll also hear a lot of things, I think, about global goal on adaptation. And the mitigation side, we'll hear things about fossil fuel phase outs and phase downs. There's a lot of complications around some of the language that we're using. But I think in terms of what we're talking about here, one of the bigger things is the global stocktake, as I mentioned, as well as something called the global goal on adaptation, which there will be a lot of conversations about how do we actually even measure adaptive measures. Right? I've heard from someone in the Cook Islands say that adaptation measures they took 15 years ago are now being overtaken by sea levels. So how do we actually effectively measure this and do this? That's something that's been a long conversation and hopefully will culminate at this COP.
Yusuf, anything to add there?
Oh, I mean, that's really great, and I do think that maybe Dan, you can add more about a little bit about loss and damage, loss and damage finance. I think that's probably one of the most important thing that folks, especially from low and middle income countries, are looking forward at this COP, to get some kind of solid number on that. So just add something there if you want.
Yeah, great point. Sorry that I missed that. I meant to mention it, I think, in the body of the presentation, but just quickly, like I said, they are setting up a fund for loss and damage. It is a sort of parallel process, and they've been having meetings along the way. They just had one, and it did not work out to the fact where they set up the fund. So that's going to continue to COP. So we'll hear more about that. And that's a really nuanced conversation, so I'm not going to get into it at this point, but it is an important one and one that we'll have to watch closely, I think.
Thank you. You all, there are so many incredible questions. I just want to pause for a moment and thank everybody for being so engaged. I want to also remind everyone that we will send, because you registered, we have your email and we'll send you the link to the recording. We will also put all of the links that I popped in the chat. Those will also be in that email. So if you're trying frantically to get all of those links, never fear. They'll come to you in an email soon. So stay tuned. And then we also put those links in the notes in the YouTube on our YouTube channel. So those will not go away. I'm glad people are happy about that. I wanted to ask a question. One of the things I really love about the work that both of you do is this intersectional piece, right? We're really moving out of silos, really looking at where are those points for yes and for the intersection among and across different sectors. And one question that came in was, what about the healthcare sector, right? How might we, and what have you thought about in terms of, there's been a lot of work in international development and aid focus on health. What are your thoughts around how we might intersect in that space?
Sure, I can go ahead. I mean, health is probably the most important or the most devastating impact of climate change, I mean, there are reports showing that children born in 2020 will face 7 to 8 times more heat waves, heat stress than the generation born in 1970s, Heat stress is killing hundreds of people every year. We saw in summer how many people died, Fossil fuel is responsible for about 8 million deaths every year. Let that sink in. Fossil fuel that causes air pollution kills so many people in low and middle income countries and also in high income countries. So there are real big tangible health benefits of implementing these solutions. A lot of kids and people died due to malnutrition. In Somalia last year, 43,000 people died due to famine that some people say can be partly attributable to climate change. So by implementing these solutions, by really looking at holistically, by providing clean energy, we are reducing fossil fuel emissions that contributes to reduction in air pollution. By improving how we grow our food, improves food security, reduces malnourishment, improves children's health. Similarly, overall, when we are addressing climate change as a whole system, we are reducing, the challenges that come from heat stress, heat waves, increased frequency, and strength of hurricanes, cyclones, and wildfire. The health benefits of implementing these solutions are immense. And in fact, health is very closely tied with all the 3 issues that we have highlighted. So, I mean, there are so many ways in which we can address health and climate and all these issues together.
Yeah, that was said perfectly, Yusuf. And actually, I'm going to jump in that is sort of on a comment that I saw in the comments section here that is sort of tangential. JB Hoover had a really great point here, and he's like, he mentions the fact that LPG is considered a clean fuel. And this is the exact same thing that I said when I first got involved in the issue. It's important to point out here that clean fuels is a WHO designation. And so it has to burn, and it can only emit so much particulate matter. So it's more of a technical definition than anything, but it is important. And you're right, LPG is not the greatest source, right? It has that and a huge supply chain. It's still risk of leaks and all this. It further entrenches our dependence on oil. However, at the same time, if it's considered a clean fuel, we are not going to take it off the table for low and middle income countries. That's for them to decide. So I just want to point that out as an excellent point, but there's just a little bit of nuance there.
Great. Thank you so much for pointing out the nuances in this really important space. I want to take just the last few seconds to share gratitude with all the people who showed up today and the people who will watch afterwards, to Dan and Yusuf for your incredible research and for sharing with folks. We welcome all of you to stay connected. Please sign up for our newsletter. Please follow us on our social media channels. And as a US-based nonprofit, we're always happy to invite you into our donor circle. So thanks everybody for all of your support. And with that, let's move more climate solutions into the world. Thanks all.